In the year 536, the sun vanished. Not for a few hours, not for a handful of days. For 18 long months, a strange and unnatural haze blanketed the skies above Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Crops wilted, famine spread across whole continents, and what followed was even more catastrophic. This is the year that historians today call the worst year in all of human history. This is the story of 536. To truly grasp what happened, you have to set aside everything you think you know about the so-called Dark Ages. Forget the storybook image of knights and castles. Forget the idea of simple peasants trudging through muddy fields. In the early 6th century, Europe was not the world of medieval legend. It was something stranger, something far more fragile, something that would come completely apart in the span of a single year. The Western Roman Empire had already collapsed 60 years earlier. The great city of Rome itself, once home to more than 1 million people, had shrunk to perhaps 30,000 souls drifting through the ruins of a civilization. Aqueducts still carried water across fields where wolves now roamed freely. Marble columns still held up the roofs of temples where no one came to pray anymore. The world had not yet fully understood that an entire age was over. In the East, however, the Roman Empire still held. From Constantinople, Emperor Justinian ruled a realm stretching from the Balkans down to Egypt, from Syria across to North Africa. His armies, commanded by the legendary general Belisarius, were on the move. His engineers were raising what would become the greatest church in the Christian world, the Hagia Sophia. His scholars were gathering and codifying the laws that would shape European civilization for the next 1,000 years. Justinian believed he was restoring the empire. He believed Rome would rise again under his hand, glorious and whole. He had no idea what was coming. In Northern Europe, the world looked entirely different. Dense, unbroken forests stretched from the coasts of what we now call Britain all the way to the rivers of Central Asia. In those forests lived the peoples Rome had once called barbarians, the Franks, the Goths, the Saxons, the Lombards, the Slavs. Some had built kingdoms on the foundations of the old empire. Others still lived in wooden longhouses, gathered around hearth fires and telling stories of their gods. Their lives were hard, but they were not poor in the way we might picture. A farmer in 6th century Gaul or Britain or the Rhineland worked a small plot of land with his family. He kept pigs, perhaps a cow, a few chickens. He grew wheat, barley, or rye. In a good year, he had enough to feed his children, brew a little ale, set aside a portion for his lord, and another for the church. He owned an iron axe, a wooden plow, a clay pot or two. His wife spun wool and wove it into cloth. His children played with bone dice and carved wooden toys. It was a small life, a quiet life, but it was a life that worked. And then came the spring of 536. The first to take note were the chroniclers, the men whose duty it was to record the events of their time. In Constantinople, a Roman official named Procopius wrote down what he witnessed, and his words have survived the centuries. He described the sun giving off its light without any real brightness, resembling the moon throughout that entire year, much like the sun during an eclipse, its beams dull and unclear. Think about what that actually means. Imagine waking up one morning to find the sun is wrong. It is still there, still visible in the sky, but it gives off no warmth. It casts no proper shadow. It looks pale and sickly, like a coin left too long in the rain. Then the next day is the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. In Italy, a senator named Cassiodorus wrote a letter to his fellow nobles trying to make sense of what was unfolding. He wrote that they marveled to look down at noon and see no shadow beneath their feet. The sun's rays had gone weak, casting a bluish hue. They had a summer stripped of heat. North winds had chilled the crops. The rain had stopped coming. In Ireland, monks in their stone monasteries kept careful records of the passing years. Their entries for 536 are brief but devastating. A failure of bread, they wrote. a failure of bread from 536 to 539. 3 years. 3 years of ruined harvests. On the other side of the world, in China, official histories recorded yellow dust falling from the sky like snow. Stars grew dim, frost arrived in summer, crops refused to ripen. This was not a local weather event. This was not one bad season in one unlucky corner of the world. It happened to the entire planet, and the people living through it had no way of knowing what. Imagine being a farmer in the Frankish kingdom, in what we now call France, in the summer of 536. You have planted your fields the same way your father did, and his father before him. You have read the sky for rain and sun and all the signs that tell a farmer when to plow and when to harvest. You know the rhythms of the seasons the way a musician knows a song. And now, the song has simply stopped. The sun rises every morning but brings no warmth. The wheat that should be standing tall and golden by midsummer stays short and pale. The leaves on the trees never reach their full green. The birds that should be singing are silent. The bees do not come. By July, frost still appears on the ground in the early morning. By August, you understand. There will be no harvest this year. You have grain stored from the year before, maybe enough for a few months, maybe enough, if you are very careful, to carry you through the winter. But then the next planting season arrives, and the sky is still wrong. The seeds you put in the ground do not grow, or they grow stunted and useless. And now your stores are nearly gone. This is what played out in millions of homes across half the world. The historians of the time reached for the only language they had, the language of religion, of omens, of divine judgment. A monk in Syria wrote that the sun had gone dark and that its darkness lasted for 1.5 years. People said the sun would never recover its full light again. Fruit did not ripen, the wine tasted of sour grapes. Across the Mediterranean, in the great library cities of the late ancient world, scholars searched their old books for any record of something like this. They found nothing. There had never been a year like this, not in living memory, not in the records of their grandfathers or their grandfathers' grandfathers. It was as if the world itself had broken. And then winter came. The winter of 536 to 537 was, by every account we have, one of the coldest and longest in recorded history. In what is now Sweden, archaeologists have uncovered something deeply unsettling. Entire villages abandoned during this period, their doors still shut. The people inside had simply died, frozen or starved or taken by sickness, and no one had come to bury them. Their bones lay where they had fallen for centuries. In Scandinavia, the population may have collapsed by as much as half during these years. Half. Picture your own village, your own town, your own city, and then imagine every second person you know is gone. The Norse peoples of the north would carry the memory of this time forward in their myths. They called it the Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter, the winter of all winters, the winter that arrives before the end of the world. In their stories, the Fimbulwinter is the signal that Ragnarok is near. The sun is swallowed, the crops fail, brother kills brother for food, the gods themselves ready for the final battle. For a long time, scholars treated the Fimbulwinter as pure myth, a poetic invention, a way of imagining total catastrophe in story form. But now we know better. The Fimbulwinter was real. Their ancestors had lived through it, and they passed the memory down from generation to generation in the only way available to them, as a story so terrible it could only belong to the end of everything. But the cold was only the beginning, because something even worse was waiting in the spring. When spring of 537 came, the people of Europe waited for the skies to clear. They had survived one dreadful year. They had buried their dead, they had eaten the last of their grain, slaughtered the last of their animals, boiled the leather of their boots in a desperate attempt to make broth. They lit candles in their churches and longhouses and prayed that this year the sun would return. It did not. The haze was still there, thinner perhaps, but still present. The chroniclers of the time describe another summer of failing crops, a second autumn without harvest. In Ireland, the monks wrote simply, "Failure of bread again." In China, imperial records described famine so severe that people resorted to unspeakable things to survive. In Mesopotamia, refugees streamed out of the countryside and poured into cities in search of food that was not there. This was the first global famine in recorded history, and the truly terrifying thing is that no one knew why. For nearly 1,500 years, 536 remained a mystery. Historians read the strange accounts of a dimmed sun and failed harvests and did not know what to make of them. Some assumed it must have been exaggeration. Medieval writers were known for dramatic language. Others suggested perhaps a comet had passed close to Earth, or that a massive forest fire had filled the sky with smoke. The truth did not begin to surface until the final decades of the 20th century, and when it did, it came from the last place anyone expected: the ice itself. Deep beneath the surface of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists were driving hollow drills down through the ancient polar ice sheets, drawing up long cylinders of frozen water that held within them an unbroken record of the Earth's atmosphere stretching back tens of thousands of years. Every distinct layer held whatever had been drifting through the air when that particular snowfall had settled and solidified: dust, pollen, microscopic chemical traces. Reading those cores was like reading a diary the planet had been keeping for itself year after year, century after century. And when the researchers examined the layers that corresponded to the year 536, they found something that stopped them cold: a towering spike in sulfate particles. That chemical signature meant only one thing: a volcanic eruption, and one of staggering scale. Something had thrown its ash so high and with such force that it had penetrated the upper levels of the atmosphere and circled the entire globe. The question was, where? For years, the scientific community could not reach a consensus. Some researchers pointed toward the tropics, perhaps a catastrophic eruption somewhere in El Salvador or Indonesia. Others argued for the North Atlantic, possibly Iceland. Then, in 2018, a team working under historian and scientist Michael McCormick at Harvard University announced a finding that settled the debate. Trapped in the Greenland ice were tiny shards of volcanic glass, invisible to the naked eye, specks only visible under a microscope. But the chemistry of those specks told the story. They matched a specific region. The source was Iceland. Somewhere on that island of fire and ice, in the early months of 536, an eruption of enormous power had split the earth open and hurled millions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide gas into the stratosphere. Prevailing winds carried that veil of dust and chemical haze eastward, across Europe, across Asia, across the Middle East. Sunlight was blocked, the northern hemisphere cooled, and the chain reaction that followed, failed harvests, famine, mass death, lasted for years. And then, as though a single catastrophe were not sufficient, another volcano erupted in 540, and possibly a third in 547. 3 major eruptions in just over a decade, the worst volcanic decade the planet had seen in 2,000 years. The people of the 6th century had no way of understanding any of this. They had no telescopes, no microscopes, no ice cores, no satellites. When the sun grew dim and refused to return to its former brightness, they reached for the only explanations their world could offer. It was the will of God. It was the work of demons. It was the revenge of older, half-forgotten gods coming back to collect what was owed to them. They responded the only ways they knew how. They fasted. They prayed. They walked in processions through their hollowed-out, starving cities. In Constantinople, the Emperor Justinian ordered new churches to be raised. In the villages of Gaul and Germania, people crept out under the darkened night sky to leave offerings at old pagan altars, hedging their bets. Across the Christian world, preachers climbed into their pulpits and announced that the end of days was finally arriving. And then, in the year 541, something appeared at the edges of the empire that seemed to confirm every dread prophecy. A ship pulled into the port of Pelusium in Egypt. It had sailed from somewhere in East Africa, perhaps even further, and it carried something none of its crew knew was aboard. It carried rats. The rats carried fleas. The fleas carried a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. We know that microbe by another name today. We call it the plague. The disease that came off that ship would, within months, tear through the entire Mediterranean world. Within a year, it had reached Constantinople, the beating heart of the empire. At the height of the outbreak, eyewitnesses claimed that 10,000 people were dying there every single day. 10,000 each day in a city that held perhaps 500,000 souls in total. The historian Procopius, the same man who had written down the account of the sun going dark, now produced one of the most chilling eyewitness testimonies in the entire ancient record. He described how the sickness began with a sudden fever, then how dark swellings pushed up through the skin. He described how some of the dying sank into a coma so deep they could not be roused, and how others were seized by such violent hallucinations that they ran screaming through the streets until they collapsed. He wrote about how the bodies accumulated faster than any human effort could bury them, how the emperor ordered great trenches dug outside the city walls and filled with the dead by the hundreds, how the towers of those same walls were packed with corpses and sealed shut because there was simply no other place left to put them. He described the smell hanging over the city. He described the silence in streets that had once been loud with people, and he wrote about how, in the end, he himself had caught the plague, and how he had survived it, and how he could never speak of those days again without a feeling of pure horror. That was the beginning of what history now calls the Plague of Justinian. Over the 2 centuries that followed, moving in wave after devastating wave, it would kill an estimated 30 to 50 million people across Europe, Asia, and Earth Africa. It would unmake the ancient world as it had been known, and it had been set into motion, at least in part, by a sun that had gone cold. By autumn of 542, the plague had reached its peak in Constantinople. The Emperor Justinian himself fell ill. He survived, but barely. His city was not so fortunate. When the outbreak finally began to ease, the population of the greatest city in the Christian world had been cut nearly in half. Entire neighborhoods stood empty and silent. Workshops sat idle. The grand construction projects Justinian had set in motion, the new churches, the rebuilt fortifications, ground to a near halt as the workers died or disappeared. Tax revenues dried up. The army shrank. The dream of rebuilding the old Roman Empire, which had seemed within reach just a handful of years before, began quietly and irreversibly to die. From Constantinople, the plague moved outward in every direction, following the veins of the ancient world, the trade routes, the rivers, the paths of armies. It reached Italy, where Justinian's general Belisarius was fighting to reclaim the peninsula from the Goths. It reached Gaul, where Frankish kings were consolidating their hold on power. It reached Spain, the British Isles, the desert regions of North Africa, and the mountain passes of Persia. A Welsh chronicle from this period records only the bare fact, the great death of Maelgwyn. Maelgwyn was a king of Gwynedd in what is now Wales. According to the tradition that grew up around him, he saw the plague drawing near, understood that he could not outrun it, and withdrew into a church to meet his end in solitude. When his followers finally broke open the doors days later, they found him dead on the cold stone floor. This story was carried forward in Welsh memory for centuries. They called it the Yellow Plague, and every village held its own version of the telling. Every family held its own dead. In Ireland, the chronicles record the plague finding its way even to the remote monasteries perched along the western coast. Saints died, scholars died. Some of the most important centers of learning in all of early medieval Europe lost half their monks or more to the sickness. In many places, the copying of manuscripts simply stopped for an entire generation. In Britain, something stranger still unfolded. The plague struck the Romano-British population, the people who descended from the old Roman province, with devastating force. But the archaeological record suggests it largely passed over the Anglo-Saxon newcomers living in the east and north of the island. The reasons remain debated. Perhaps the Saxons had less contact with the Mediterranean trade networks that carried the disease. Perhaps their communities were simply more isolated from one another. Perhaps it was nothing more than chance. But the outcome was profound. In the decades following the plague, the balance of power across Britain shifted decisively and permanently. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms grew. The Romano-British kingdoms withered. The England that exists today, its language, its place names, the very word England itself, may owe something of its existence to a microscopic bacterium that arrived on a ship in the year 541. The consequences rippled outward across the wider world for generations. Around the Mediterranean, the great cities never fully recovered their former scale. Trade contracted, coins became scarce. The networks that had held the Roman world together, the shipping lanes, the roads, the shared currency, frayed and eventually broke apart. Europe folded inward. The age we call the early Middle Ages, with its smaller kingdoms and its more local horizons, was shaped in no small part by the accumulated deaths of the 540s. To the east, the Sasanian Persian Empire, the great rival of Rome, was laid equally low. Within a century, both Rome and Persia had been worn down by repeated waves of plague, to the point where they could no longer defend what they had always defended. Into that weakness stepped a new force from the Arabian Peninsula. The armies of the early Islamic caliphates swept across territories that just decades earlier would have been fortified beyond any hope of conquest. Some historians now argue that the rise of Islam as a world-shaping power would have been impossible to imagine without the long shadow cast by the year 536. And that, perhaps, is the hardest thing to hold in mind about that year. It did not only kill people, it killed possibilities. It destroyed possibilities. It wiped out the world that could have existed. Picture for a moment the Roman Empire that Justinian came so close to restoring. Picture a Mediterranean that remained bound together beneath Constantinople's rule. Picture the libraries of Alexandria still standing, the philosophy schools of Athens still in session, the deep memory of the ancient world carried forward without a break into the ages that followed. Picture a Europe that never passed through what we call the Dark Ages at all. That world was within reach. That world was perhaps even likely. And it perished somewhere above Iceland in the early days of 536, when a mountain tore open and its ash climbed into the sky. What we got in its place was something different, something smaller and slower, poorer in so many ways than the world that had come before. Libraries burned or were simply forgotten. Roads fell apart. The everyday literacy that had been genuinely impressive in Roman times vanished almost completely. For 3 or 4 centuries across most of Europe, the flame of learning burned very low. But, and this matters, it did not go out. In monasteries scattered from Ireland to Italy, monks went on copying the old books. In villages stretching from Wales to Bulgaria, peasants went on planting the old crops. The skills endured. The stories endured. The faith, in its many forms, endured. And slowly, over long centuries, a new world rose on the foundations of the old. The Europe that stepped out from the long shadow of 536 was not the Europe of Rome. It was something else entirely. It was the Europe of Charlemagne and the great medieval cathedrals, and eventually of the Renaissance and the modern era. A world born, in a very real sense, out of darkness. When we look back today at the people who lived through 536, the Frankish farmer watching his crops fail, the Roman senator writing his bewildered letters about a sun that had lost its brightness, The Welsh king who shut himself inside a church to die alone. What we feel, if we let ourselves feel anything at all, is something close to awe. They had no understanding of what was happening around them. There were no scientists to explain volcanic aerosols, no microbiologists to identify Yersinia pestis, no ice cores to read back the planet's own record. All they had was their faith, their families, their fields, and their hope that the sun would eventually find its way back. And here is the extraordinary thing. It did. The haze lifted, the harvests came again. The children of those who had lived through 536 inherited a world that was harder than anything their grandparents had known. But it was still a world. They lived inside it. They built inside it. They passed down stories about the year their ancestors had endured. And those stories, carried forward in monastery chronicles and Norse poems and Welsh legends and Chinese histories, have reached us across 1,500 years, so that we today can know what truly happened, so that we can stand in the long chain of human memory and say, yes, it was real, and yes, they came through. That is what 536 teaches us, if it teaches us anything at all. Not that the world was ending, but that even when it appeared to be, it was not. And so that is the full account of the worst year in recorded human history. The year the sun went dark. The year the harvests died. The year plague arrived from the east on a ship. The year a volcano in Iceland bent the fate of 3 continents.